Hi guys, Cade Wilcox here, host of the Primitive Podcast. In this week's episode, we have Clay Johnson joining us. Clay Johnson has a fascinating story. Grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, ended up going to Hanover private school in Connecticut with George W. Bush, and long story short, ended up serving alongside of him for 16 years, all the way through George W.'s governorship, and then obviously in the presidency. He was in charge of many things like transition plans and presidential personnel. It's just a fascinating story, but probably the most interesting thing to me about the podcast is just listening to Clay's different leadership insights and not only his own personal years of experience being a leader, but being around leaders like George W. and others who obviously, were some of the most critical leaders on the world stage. So hope you enjoy this episode. And as always, thank you for listening. Clay, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have you on our show. I was actually running a couple of weeks thinking through different guests that I could have on the podcast, and like a lightning bolt, it hit me that I should reach out to you and ask if you'd be willing to come on. And I'm thrilled that you said yes. I've had the privilege of having multiple conversations with you because of both of our mutual relationship with Jody Arrington, who's now our congressman here in Lubbock. But many people will have not been exposed to your leadership or to you, and so I'm really thrilled to share with them my relationship with you and let them learn from you. So thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks. I'm honored, Kate, to be asked to talk to you about leadership. And funny, I did a thing last week for a friend of mine who has a company in Washington, and she asked me to visit with her 15 project managers to talk about leadership and leadership in an environment of crisis. And so then I did a call for you. So it's
good
anyway.
timing. Everyone's
I like talking about it.
good. Well, everyone's hungry. I think.
To do it.
Yeah, everyone's hungry for insight into leadership and really learning. And as our audience will learn, you've been around some of the best leaders in the world, and so it's going to be a really, really great experience. So let's start out by going through your background and sharing your story. Again, many of our listeners, won't know you immediately, but certainly as you share your story, they will. So let's start by going through your background and you share as much as you'd like to.
Right. I was born in Fort Worth. My father was a rancher in Oklahoma. I was a good student growing up. He felt like he never really didn't take school in high school or college seriously. I was a good student, so he hoped that I would take seriously what he didn't, and would really be serious about my education. And so I followed his lead on it. And he encouraged me to think about going away to school, starting in high school. And so I was a plenty good student for the Fort Worth Public Schools, but not quite good enough to be considered for a prep school up east. So I was tutored for a year, even though I was making all A's in Fort Worth, and got up to the point where I was accepted by a school called Andover in Massachusetts. And I went from there to applying to Yale, got into Yale, and I got interested in some things at Yale that could best be studied at MIT. So I ended up going to business school at MIT. So about as good an education as somebody could get. So I graduated from MIT. I was married at this point. I came back to Texas and went to work for Frito-Lay in 1970 in marketing. So I was in marketing positions for about 10 years, mostly with Frito-Lay. Then I went into a general management position with a catalog mail order company in Dallas called the Horshaft Collection. Roger Horshaft started this in 1970. It was 1970, and so it was the late 70s, and his growth had sort of flattened out, and he was advised to hire a marketing person. So someone steered him towards me, and I went to work for him. I was with him 10 years, and it was just a fabulous place to work. Really talented people, and they just need to have different way to be shaken up a little bit in terms of how they think about the business, think about it perhaps in some different ways. And that's what I helped them do. And we ended up selling the company to Neiman Marcus, and I stayed on with them for another 3 years. So I had 10 years in the mail order business in a senior executive role after 10 years in marketing. I had made some money when we sold to Neiman Marcus, so I had some money to be really focused on what kind of work I was going to do as opposed to just how much money I might be able to make. Or I was able to really think brand thoughts about what kind of things I might want to be interested in or get involved in. I got involved in some nonprofit things, helping a guy try to apply Sesame Street to preschool education, not just through television, but directly. And a guy named Ralph Rogers, fabulous guy, great philanthropist in Dallas, and that was a wonderful experience. Um, the other thing I got in that I thought I would be involved in for about a year and a half was I went to work for George W. Bush when he was still a candidate for governor, and was with him. I thought I'd be with him for about a year and a half. I was with him all 14 years. I met George Bush at Andover. He was from Houston. I was from Fort Worth. There were 22 students from Yale, not that I remember or anything, but 22 students from Yale. I mean, from Fort Worth at the Andover out of 740. So we Texans felt like we were surrounded by a bunch of Yankees. So we, sought solace with each other's company. But anyway, I met this guy, and his parents were, his dad was in the oil business, and his grandfather had been a senator from Connecticut, but he was just George W. Bush from Houston, Texas. He wasn't the son of the president or anything. And I was just Clay Johnson from Fort Worth still. But anyway, so we got to be very good friends, played mediocre basketball together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Was a wonderful guy. We ended up going to Yale, and we were roommates all 4 years at Yale. So I've known George really well. Our wives are really good friends since 1961, long time. And I'll talk about him a little bit later. But he asked me when he was running for governor, living in Dallas, just about the time he was going to getting ready to tee it up. I remember it vividly. He and Laura asked Ann, my wife Ann, and me to have lunch with him one Saturday at Solly's Barbecue in north of Dallas. And we went out there and we were enjoying the barbecue. And he said, "Let me tell you why I wanted you to come up here. I'm going to win this governorship race." We thought he had no chance because he's running against Ann Richards. He said, "I'm going to win this thing. And I want you to come down there with me and help me set up my administration." And I'm not a political person, not at all. And what I think I know about politics is wrong. And I said, "Well, so what does that mean?" He said, "Well, the governor of Texas appoints 3,500 or 4,000 people, which is about the same number of people that are appointed by the president, as it turns out."
Wow.
And so there's an appointments office, and the appointments office finds people to recommend to the governor to appoint to these different positions, like the people that run the UT system and the A&M system and the health system and so forth and so on. And I know you don't know anything about politics. That's why I want you to do it. You'll be focusing on finding the best people. That's my goal for you. You find the best people for me to appoint. And people like Karl Rove and the Political Affairs Group, they'll make sure that we don't do anything stupid politically. So that's what I did. I thought I'd be doing it about a year and a half. And so I got into it. We were good at it. I got really, really interested in it. We kept getting better and better at it. And I think did about as good a job and figured out all the different aspects of it way more than anybody else has ever done, if I do say so myself. But
Yeah.
so anyway, I was with him all the time he was governor and all the time that he was president. Um, so that's my background.
Were you in that role? Were you in that role when he was governor the entire time, or did you kind of move roles after that? Like,
I
what
was
were your
in that
roles after
role for
that?
4.5 years.
Okay.
And then so I didn't have policy involvement. I had nothing to do with working with the legislature, except we had to get the Senate to approve, I don't know, 600 or 700 of the appointees. And so I worked with senators to curry favor with them and make them aware who we were suggesting to be appointed and so forth, and explain why, and so get them on the program. When his chief of staff, Joe Albaugh, was going to go over and run his campaign for the presidency, he asked me to come up to run to be the chief of staff. And he said, The legislature won't be in session. You don't have to do political things with the legislature to help move legislation along. Because if that was the case, I wouldn't be asking you to do that. I'd be asking somebody else who had political wherewithal. But you to keep the governor's office involved where they need to be involved and implementing things and dealing with issues or crises or whatever. And we'll be in constant communication. I'll be coming back through town a lot. So that's what that was all about. So it was 4.5 years in the personal operation and performance operation, and about almost 20 months as chief of staff. The other thing he told me to do, which I'll talk about a little later, is he said the other thing besides being my chief of staff, he said, I'm going to win this presidency, and I want you to develop a plan for what I do when I win the presidency. Now, I thought, is this guy full of himself, or what in the world is he talking about? And most presidents, it turns out, are reluctant to think about winning the presidency. They thought it was bad luck. Bad luck? You're running for the presidency and you are counting on luck to help you get elected? Come on. Bush knew from his father and his involvement being around the White House stuff what starting an administration was like. And if you wait until you're elected to start planning for what you're going to do when you're going to take office, who you're going to bring into be your chief of staff and in the White House and so forth, you have only 75 days or so to prepare to be a good president. That's not enough. And so he tasked me with the job 18 months in advance.
Wow.
So one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit is the key to getting things done is you start with a picture of success and work backwards. Rarely done, must be always done. That's what he did. He was already thinking about what's the definition of success. His definition of success for me on the appointment side was find out what we want this person to do by talking to the appropriate people on my staff, and then find the person who can best do that. And on the transition, find out what a president has to have in place by January 20th of inauguration, and figure out what we need to plan ahead of time to be able to do in the 75 days we have. And it turned out we had a plan, really detailed. I love passing it around. It's fabulous, if I do say so myself again. But we didn't have 75 days. We had 33 days, I think, or something, because of the thing that went to the Supreme Court. But anyway, so that was my involvement with Bush.
So once okay, this was super interesting. So you kind of created the roadmap. So he wins. You had created the roadmap. It got condensed because of that election being pushed to the Supreme Court, his first election. What was your role for him once all the dust settled? You had created that plan. Like, what was your role in his presidency?
What was my role in the presidency?
Yeah, like once he was elected and the plan was implemented.
So starting when he was elected president, I became the executive director of the transition. I had planned it. About 2 months before, Bush said, Clay, with all due respect, you're going to know the most about this transition, but nobody knows you. And so if I made you the head of the transition, they'd go, who? I need to get somebody with more name ID who's the head of the thing. And I said, that's fine by me. So he made selected Cheney to be the chairman, and I became his executive director. And we conferred a lot about how to make things. So anyway, that was going into it. So then the question was,
well, so you were with him all 8 years of his presidency, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was your role? So were you just the executive director of the transition the entire time, or what'd you do after that?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Memory loss. So I ran, because I was the best person to do it in the United States, to be the head of the federal equivalent of what I did for 4.5 years in Austin, which was be the head of what's called presidential personnel. And so Jody Arrington, for instance, had worked with me in the governor's office for, he was there all 6 years and worked in personnel that whole time. And so he went up with us and was one of the three people that went into presidential personnel up there, because we knew exactly how President Bush would want that research to be done, that conversation to be done, because we had done it for him to his total satisfaction for 6 years.
Yeah, a long time.
And so it really worked out well. So I was the head of personnel, president of personnel for the first 2 years, and then he said, Clay, we've just about filled all the main positions. We just about filled all the main positions for the first time. The next series of openings will be when they leave, and so you'll be you'll be moving some people into new positions, you'll be bringing new people in, and so forth. I want to make sure you stay up here and stay excited about it, and you may be a little less, jazzed up if you're kind of recycling through all those same jobs again. I wish you would find something within the organization, within the federal government, that you'd like to run. I don't, with all due respect, I wouldn't suggest a cabinet department, but something else than that. And I said, well, sir, actually, since you asked, the thing that I'd love to do most of all is I'd like to go be the deputy director for management at the Office of Management and Budget. And he said, the what? I said, well, you know about OMB, and you know about the budget part of OMB. There's a management part of OMB, and that's what I would love doing, because that person works with all the chief operating officers for the federal agencies, and you're usually the deputy secretaries, and works on management policy and coordinates and help. They can learn from each other, facilitate what they're doing individually in their agencies, what they're doing, like one another, across agencies, and set higher goals, and for the federal government to be more results oriented than it is. The federal government does not work like it should, and this is the person in your federal government that leads all efforts to make the federal government more results oriented. I would love to be that person. He said, you be it. That will be you. So I went over there and worked around that job, and then when I was confirmed by the Senate, I held that job for the last 6 years.
Okay. Wow. That's awesome. This has nothing to do with leadership, but I'm really curious, and then I'll move on to some more leadership oriented questions. Who within a president, all presidents, and maybe there's some variation from one to the other, but who oftentimes yields influence on the most strategic roles that a president puts around themselves? You were doing appointments, and that was thousands of people put in positions, but who influences a president as it relates to, some of the most senior and executive roles around them? For Bush, I think of people like, Condi Rice and, people like that. Like, who really influences those people who you always see at the right hand or the left hand of the president?
Well, for instance, those are they're certainly the cabinet secretaries, but also the senior people in the White House staff. So one of the things that that was in the transition report about what you need to do, sir, is pick a chief of staff, and don't wait until your election day. You need to pick a chief of staff a month or 6 weeks or so ahead of time, so that person can start talking to you when you've got a spare moment in those final weeks of the campaign, and just start brainstorming with you about who you're thinking about for this and that and so forth. And so that discussion was to be held by him, and he had agreed to have that discussion with me. I think it was 5 or 6 weeks before the election. And so he said, well, I'm really like Andy Card, and I've had a lot of dealings with him, and he was my dad's administration, da, 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 da. And so I think he'd be a great chief of staff, and I'm thinking he's the guy I ought to ask. And I said, then you ought to ask him. So we picked up the phone, he called Andy, and da, 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 da. So you started with that, and then he and Andy then start working on who's the chief of staff. And so I'm sure the president had, or candidate for president, or then governor, wanted Condi to be national security advisor, wanted Margaret Spellings to be this and that, and wanted Karen Hughes to be the head of communications, and people that he was very close to and very confident in, and were just national caliber, if not world caliber people. And so he made all those decisions in his own mind and talked to Andy about it. And then there was things in there about you need to be able to pick the secretaries we had a date, which was like December 20th, have them all there and be sent to the names, be sent to the Senate so the Senate could start deciding whether they wanted to start having hearings. Technically, they're not supposed to have hearings before the president is the president, or the president-elect is the president, but they usually make an exception for a new president and have unofficial hearings so they can have votes right after the nomination, I mean, right after the swearing in. So anyway, so he knew that there were certain policy decisions had to be made, who the policy people were going to be that we would be talking to, who the legislative affairs person would be that we could be talking to, and so forth. So all those decisions internally were made. And actually, what Andy started doing was he started meeting with them as a group. So I was going to be on the senior staff as the head of President's Personnel, and Margaret Spellings and Condi and so forth. So we started meeting as a group every morning during the transition, just to get the chemistry, get to used to being around a big conference table with each other and learning about what kind of sense of humor or not people had. And anyway, it worked out great.
Fascinating. I mean, it's building. I mean, you're tasked with the responsibility, and like you said, you know this as well as anyone in the country. You're tasked with building a world-class organization in a very short period of time. And it's one of my favorite parts about being a business owner is hiring and building a team, and by hiring and building a team, you're building a culture. And like you had to do that on steroids in a very short period of time. So it's really fascinating. I got so many more questions.
Now I had from June of '99 till say August 1st of 2000, 15 months or so to develop that plan. And then he started pulling people in to share the plan with them. So, but by that point, I had reviewed it with Cheney. I had reviewed it with people like Josh Bolton, who became the policy person, and other key people, Margaret Spellings and so forth, who were going to be involved. So there was a lot about the plan was there, but we knew what we had to do, and we knew by when we wanted to do it. We all agreed on that. And once the gun went off, we then started doing it. And actually, Cheney decided, it was Cheney, that Vice President Cheney, who decided that we were going to begin on, we didn't want to wait until the election was decided. So he called everybody, the White House staff, to Washington, and he raised some money to create an office, a transition office, privately funded. And we started making presidential personnel decisions or developing recommendations before Bush was even officially the president. Right. And so we just couldn't wait. As Cheney said, we couldn't wait. And he was such a senior guy. He had been, in Congress. He had been, in the Defense Department, whatever. And then he just knew he could do that and needed to be done. And it was that important.
That's cool. Okay, well, I have several questions for you, kind of, your own leadership. And then here in a little bit, maybe we can talk about your observations of President Bush and his leadership and other leaders that you were surrounded by. But how did, you were responsible for a lot of things. So how did you try to view your own leadership?
The first leadership position I ever had that was not just the product manager or the assistant product manager, the product manager on Fritos or something, which I was one time, I was about 28 or 29, and there was a group for a nonprofit group that had 500 young adults, members who helped raise money for the arts in Dallas. And we used to put on a mediocre art festival in Dallas inside an empty parking garage over a weekend and raise, I don't know, $5,000 or something. It was one of the things we did during the year. And so for one of them, I was selected to be the head of food. It's a telling story, but bear with me. So I was the food chairman, and which means I brought some Fritos to sell. And anyway, so then the head of this thing, at the end of it, said, "Come up with let me have your suggestions for what this art festival ought to be next year." Well, I wrote an entire business plan for it. Most people expected a half a page, so I wrote about a 3-page business plan. And a friend of mine, Ron Steinhardt, who's a well-known banker, now retired for many years in Dallas, read it and he said, "This is incredible, Clay. Guess who's the head of the Art Festival next year? You." So I took it, put together a team. I had never been the head, you know, didn't answer to anybody. And we put on at the first outdoor art festival, citywide art festival in Dallas history. It raised $25,000 in front of the art museum in Dallas. It was fabulous. And I thought, I can do this. This is fun, really. But it started with me figure out what the goal is, and then figure out, starting with the goal, then figure out what we might do, and then try to bring that enthusiasm and that mindset to a group of people and involve more people in brainstorming about how to deliver on that promise. So my whole approach of leadership is help the group of people. It's like being a coach in my mind. It's help facilitate, help create a group of people, and then help them be smart. First of all, about figuring out what's the goal, what's the picture of success we're trying to paint, and then once you've got that, work backwards to focus on what we've got to do between now and whenever this picture of success is supposed to be complete. Is it a year from now, 3 years from now? When do we want this to happen? And so that we are focused, everything we do in the short term is related to what we want to do ultimately in the long term. Because usually it starts the other way. You say, well, what do I want to do next week to start showing that I'm working on it? And you end up only working on it. The federal government in particular, but most government entities, but the further away from the people you get, in this case, the federal government, the more difficult it is for the government to pay attention to accomplishing desired outcomes. Because you have to make difficult decisions, and it's hard to show progress in the short term because you've got to pass a bill and appropriate money. You're just getting started. You haven't accomplished anything yet. You've got to then start spending the money effectively to accomplish the desired outcome. And most people aren't going to be in, like members of the House may not be there when you start spending the money wisely. Anyway, so it's picture of success, work backward to the president. George Marshall, I ran across a famous quote by him, the former head of the Marshall Plan and one of the top generals during World War II. He made a comment, I don't know in what context. He said, if you pick your battle objectives well enough, a second lieutenant can write the battle plan. It's all about, what are your goals? What are we doing here? I'm going to talk about it in a little bit. I heard a story of a Bush was meeting with the senior people at the Defense Department about, I don't know what, I can only imagine. And at one point he stopped him. He said, wait a minute, we're moving around here. What's the purpose of the Defense Department? And the people who told me about this said, these guys were looking at each other like, man, now there's a question we've never been asked before. But that's the kind of person he was. Where are we? What are we here to? What do we exist for? What is this? We have the Defense Department for? We were getting away from what the picture was that they were trying to paint. So
that's good.
So in other words, so it's a picture of success working backwards. And a part of all that, a key part of it is you're doing it with a group of people. Nobody walks in with the answers if you're trying to do something significant. And so you've got a group of people, many of them super high powered, super involved. They're the head of their own organizations. You pull in the heads of these different organizations together. You can't do it with those people. You have to do it. You can't do it to those people. You have to do it with those people. You can't order them around because they're the ones that are going to have the most knowledge about what has to happen when rubber meets the road. They know more about the particulars of the agencies involved than you do. So what you are is kind of a facilitator, an enabler, a coordinator, asking good questions, keeping everybody on track. And you've got to do, it's a partnership. You have to do it with them. And you think of it as you are working to be successful. And as you make decisions, it's so that they can be successful, not you. No one will ever remember who called this meeting, but it's the people that put the agency together that will be the ones to be celebrated. And so what we got in the business of doing at Horchak, in the federal government, was when we were working on some complicated thing within an agency or involving a bunch of different agencies. When we got to the end and we had been a success, when something that was a high risk operation ended up being rated a low risk operation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we would go out and celebrate with them. And the senior members of of the agency would come and brag about their people, and I'd get up there and brag about the people, and we'd have lemonade and chips or whatever we had, and applaud them for forever changing the effectiveness of their agency.
Mm.
It was not about what we in the White House had done. It's what they had done for their fellow employees and all future employees. And you talk about people who were proud as punch. They just loved that. And it was all about, and that's the kind of mindset you need to create. So I got into that early, and it worked great. And I could see it working in Horchow when I was there. And it just worked in the state government as well as the federal government.
That's really good. Did you have a specific approach to learning from failure? I'm curious, everyone talks about how important it is to learn from failure, but very few people actually have a method or a real intentional way of being able to document or whatever the case may be to really absorb and learn from failure. And I'm curious, in your years of leadership and watching other leaders, is there anything about learning from failure that really sticks out to you or you think is really critical for a leader?
Well, as unaccustomed as I am to failure, to me, it's like success. It's something to learn from. And so first of all, you call a spade, and you call a failure, or a shortcoming, or an example. When Bush called us on something, President Bush called us on something. You figure out where you fell short, why you fell short, how you can not fall short going forward, but also how you can go in and correct what's going on. And it's just you just have to constantly review how you're doing and never take yourself that seriously. If you just can't take yourself that seriously. You have to admit that you're a bunch of humans, and nobody ever said that humans are perfect. So
right. No, that's good. What about managing your time? This is something I've really looked forward to asking you because a lot of folks listening to this podcast, myself included, fancy ourselves as really busy, right? You got families, you got kids, you got businesses, you got employees, you got meetings. And when you start to think about that on a kind of federal government level and the office of the president and the most powerful human in the world, you start to think, okay, I probably am not as busy, as someone like that. And so I have two questions for you, and you can take this wherever you want. One, I'd love to hear how you managed your time and what you observed of other people who had to manage their time, very strictly. And then the second thing is I've read some, material that you've written on how to have effective meetings. And I know you have some strong thoughts on that, given that you were in so many of them throughout your life and you're about efficiencies and results. And so the first part of the question is, how did you manage your time or what were things that you observed about people who were effective at managing their time? Second part of the question is just your general thoughts on how to have an effective meeting and just anything related to meetings as it comes to your mind.
Yeah, great. As I mentioned, I'm very analytical and a list maker. And so when someone says, I got to do something, I say, okay, well, what does that mean? And when do I need to do it by? And so like when you said, Clay, would you have to do this podcast? I'd love to have you done it. When is it Thursday? So then you start back and back. When do I need to, what do I need to know? So I thought, what are your questions? And then what are my preliminary answers? And the thing, and figure out when I needed to do by Tuesday, by Wednesday, and here we are. And so I make lists, and then one of the things some of the lists is what other lists do I need to make, kind of thing. So it's to a fault, but the rumor has it that people that get into their 70s sometimes their memory fades. I'm not saying that's true or not, but I've heard it, and I think it might be true. So I've got a lot of 3x5 cards in my pocket about when to do stuff, and this is stuff I need to do today versus tomorrow, and so on and so on. So I'm very disciplined that way. And people that are less disciplined that way usually surround themselves with somebody that is. Um, it's one of the things I learned starting back as a senior in college, um, taking from a guy, a famous organizational behavior person named Chris Argyris, talk about groups. He said, um, groups, it's the sum of the people, and they're all not alike. And the thing that makes a group so powerful is you have people that complement each other in their abilities. And so if you have somebody that's very analytical like I am, the next person, you get another person in there brings some other things, and he or she can be less analytical because Clay's over here to kind of keep them on a discipline thing, or vice versa. Or if this person is a gifted writer, I had a woman that worked for me who was very, very talented in these areas, and she had only gotten superlative ratings in her time at the federal government. But one of the things I thought was she was a bad communicator in writing, or needed, not bad, could be a lot better, more effective. And so I pointed it out to her, and she was shocked. And I said, so don't take it as an insult. Take it as an opportunity. And so the answer is not you go to writing school or anything. The answer is get somebody on your staff who has a gift with a pen and a typewriter and computer and whatever. And so you tell her what you tell a person what you want to say, and they'll tell it in a very effective way. And she did that, and more within 6 months' time, she was the darndest, letter writer, memo writer, report writer, and so forth going. And so it's complementary meetings. I mean, the complementary teams the people complement each other. The thing that I do is, in terms of meetings, is you start. What's the purpose of the meeting?
Mm-hmm.
What's the definition of success for this meeting? It's going to be next Thursday at 8:00, and it's going to last an hour. And so at the end, what do we want to say we have done there? And you want to communicate that to the people you're inviting, and you want to give them have the agenda, how it's organized, who's going to be there, and if there's material that they can read ahead of time that's relevant to that they might, if you don't distribute it to them ahead of time, they have to spend meeting time to read it. Send it to them ahead of time, unless it's controversial or
Mm-hmm.
your eyes only kind of thing. So what the meeting is related to, what's the so what of the information? How might we proceed? And be realistic of what you can accomplish in that first hour, as opposed to we're going to come out with a cure for cancer. No, we're not going to come out with a cure for cancer. So think about what the reasons are. I mean, what the goals are. Then you have the meeting, you come in together, and you're following your agenda. And the language you use in a meeting is important. One of the things is to always, certain key words that we use, particularly in the management world, the M and OMB world that I was in for 6 years, you want to use the word results a lot. I remember being with somebody after I'd been at OMB a couple of years, and we were watching the president make some speech on television during the day. And the president was talking about the results and the results. He mentioned the word results 3 or 4 times. And somebody said, Clay, the president's using that word you use all the time.
Yeah, I know, that's really good.
And so it just, in their mind, it just understands it about results. And another word is effectiveness, as opposed to, for instance, one of my pet peeves, efficiency. Efficiency is a very scary word to use around public employees, because efficiency generally connotes we need fewer employees here. Do it for less money, and that generally means with fewer employees. And efficiency can mean maybe you hire different people. Anyway, it scares employees.
Right.
And to be effective, a subset of the meaning of effectiveness is greater efficiency, which means you're spending your money more wisely, and maybe you're spending much more over here so you can be more efficient about this money, or whatever. So, but just don't highlight efficiency. You're going to raise concerns, anxieties that are unnecessary. So no efficiency, whole lot of talking about effectiveness. You also want to talk about, you want to congratulate people. When somebody has a really good idea, say, that's a really good idea. that's a really results-oriented idea. Now you're talking about greater effectiveness. Oh, there I used all three words in the same series of, series of
Affirmation.
sentences.
Yeah.
And um, so I, at one time I had a meeting with or at the end of a meeting with the president. Everybody else had left, and I stood, waited back. And I said, Mr. President, I have one suggestion out of the blue for you. And he said, what's that? He said, when you go around, you meet with employees and so forth, you hear about what they're doing, and you're very glad to hear them, and you have great appreciation for them, and you invariably thank them for their work and their service. And my suggestion to you is thanks is not the right word. Thanks suggests that they're doing it as a favor. Actually, these people are full-time employees. They have a goal, perhaps. They are aspiring. They had a plan that said, let's do this by this date. And when they did it, they accomplished their goal. They ran the race in the desired time, or they got it done when they said they were going to do it. So they did something they hoped to do. And in my mind, that means you should congratulate them as opposed to thanking them. And he looked at me with a quizzical look and said, I never thought about it that way. Let me think about that, and I'll get back to you. Well, anyway, a few days later, I saw him somewhere, and he said, call me over. And he said, I've been thinking about congratulations. He said, it's a little too fancy a word for me, but nice job is what I feel really comfortable saying. I said, nice job it is. That means the same thing.
Yeah.
Nice job from you means 1,000 congratulations from me. So, I mean, just go get them with nice job. But again, just recognizing, even in a meeting, a couple of times to add a little lightheartedness to meetings, I would take in two cards, about yay big. One was red, i.e., avoid this, and it had a B on it. B stand for bureaucratic. There was another card the same size, these are plastic cards, that was green is good, that had an R for results on it. And I would tell them ahead of time, you're probably wondering what these two cards are, which we're going to have this hour-and-a-half discussion and so forth and brainstorm a little bit. So I hope we have lots of results-oriented thinking, not so much bureaucratic thinking, and let's recognize it when we hear it. So I'll put it down. My arm got tired of raising that green R card, and they were inclined that way anyway, but it just made the point,
right,
in a lighthearted way. There are things you can do in the meeting. I mean, and there are things, if the meeting is going to be a contentious meeting, there are ways you can manage potential contention. You can not put on, if this group of people is likely to be sort of vehemently opposed with this other group, don't seat them with each other. So, cycle them around the thing. You can also threaten to issue yellow cards and red cards, like in soccer, if someone is overtly disrespectful of the other people, which I've done a few times. And again, somewhat lighthearted, but it caused us to have an unbelievably effective meeting.
Right.
And then at the end of the meeting, sorry for me.
No, this is good. This is good.
At the end of the meeting, there's a summary of what was accomplished and what the next steps are. Very clear going in and very clear coming out. What got done, what still had to get done, and what the next steps are.
That's really good. Yeah, I've referred back to that Word document. I mean, I think it's been 3-4 years now since you sent me that Word document where you had written down a lot of ideas about meetings and things that are critical, and it's really shaped how I try to approach meetings, because in my humble opinion, there's nothing worse than a waste of time in a meeting where there are no results. I serve on a handful of city committees, like TIF board and things like that, and thankfully it's led by Robert Taylor, who's an extremely effective executive of, he's the CEO of United Supermarkets, so he's into results too. But there are times where it'll start lingering and you'll just feel like, okay, we're just, there's nothing results oriented about this, and you just start getting anxious. So your kind of thoughts on this and the writings that you shared with me have really influenced the way I try to approach meetings, and I really appreciate it. I need to get a lot better for sure, but it's been really helpful. Well, maybe we only have a few more.
That may be the key.
Sure.
the overriding summary of everything you said is, what were you trying to accomplish? You started with that. Maybe you didn't use those words, but it's what's the picture of success that we're
Mhm.
going to be painting as a result of this meeting?
Yeah, I like using the phrase "What does success look like?" Which is very similar to what you've been saying. What is it that we expect to what does success look like at the end of this? And it's similar to what you said about working backwards. Identify the target and then work backwards. And I like doing the same thing. It's like, what does ultimately success look like? And then what are the key kind of objectives that we got to accomplish in order to get from where we are to where we want to go, and where we're going is success. So I like that. And I think it's a really helpful framework. Let's finish our time, if you don't mind. I would love to hear your thoughts on. I mean, you were with President Bush a long time. I think you said 16 years. In a vocational sense, right? Working years, much longer, even just relationally. And I'm really curious as what your observation of him would be in terms of the three or four or two or three most significant things that you observed about his leadership.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. We talk about picture of success. He was that way with me from day one. It wasn't. I mean, he would, and he. It's a focus of mine. Well, his focus was probably genetic,
Mm.
and I was mine was an acquired understanding. But he, from the very earliest on, it's like when he said, "I want you to come and help me find the best people to do the work for our administration as governor in Texas." That was the desired outcome, the picture of success. When he said to go be chief of staff, and oh, by the way, I want you to develop a plan for what I do when we win the presidency. That's the picture of success. I'm going to win it. I want to be able to spend those 75 days unlike any other president has spent. I want to get more done more effectively, so forth. That definition of success. When he asked at the Defense Department meeting, what's the purpose of DOD? Those people had never been asked that question. I don't know what the topic was they were talking about otherwise, but but that's what it was. One of the things that where he pulled me down off my high horse one time in a meeting was we used to meet at least annually with him about talk about management stuff at the federal government. And so I had all the deputy secretaries or the chief operating officers of the agencies there, and we were talking and we were bragging about all the great work we were doing on this area in computers and HR and financial management and all these things and how we manage programs and all this transparency we had. And he said, "Well, Clay, that's great. I really like that. You have a scorecard so you keep track of it. It's really great. But let me ask you, when you've got all the computers you need and HR practices and the financial management stuff, and it's all, is there a guarantee that our citizens are definitely being better served by their government? Guaranteed." There was this unbelievable silence in the room. I looked briefly around at the other people there, the deputy secretaries in particular. People were fidgeting with their papers, and I said, "Well, Mr. President, I'm embarrassed to say it's not guaranteed. That gives you all the tools you need to be effective, but there are other mechanisms you have to be sure you've got that you're applying transparency to ensure that you are measuring in a transparent fashion exactly what we're doing for the citizens and how does it compare to how we were treating them in the past." And so all these dealings, it started with what are we trying to do here? What is it about? A comment about him, a 15-year-old version of George W. Bush, 15-year-old Bush when he was 15. He was a leader then and a results-oriented guy then. He didn't think of it in those terms. Um, at Andover, they picked we created an informal stickball league where you played baseball with a broomstick and a tennis ball and so forth. And it's just something to pass the time of day with on slow Thursday afternoons or something. And the students, the seniors got together and elected Bush the commissioner of the stickball league, which wasn't a hard, but he was the guy that would be the best able to do everything possible to get it off and running, and also people would enjoy the most being around. And he would be doing it for them, not to them, with them, not to them. And The leadership of the school picked a group of people, usually they were leaders in the senior class or the junior class, to be the head of school, a group of people that were the head of school spirit. And they picked the head of that group. Bush, junior in high school, George W. Bush, was selected to be the head of the school spirit squad, which was a group of all the top, most talented people in the school, in the senior class, to be in charge of school spirit. It wasn't cheerleading at football games, it was
Right.
school spirit. And at the end of our senior year, when the time was being passed to somebody, uh, he said, while the new guy's coming up, I want to personally congratulate George W. Bush and his spirit leaders, because I've been at this school 42 years and I've never seen school spirit as high as it was this last year. No, he didn't go to spirit school. He didn't go to leadership school.
Right.
His senior staff, his first Christmas as president, um, somebody had the idea to put together a bowl, and we were going to come up with the adjectives that we thought best described him, and put those adjectives in random fashion around this bowl, engrave them on there so he could have it on a key table at his house or the West Wing or whatever. And we thought there'd be about 8 or 10 words that everybody could agree on. There were 34 adjectives.
Wow.
They were words like honest, results-oriented, genuine, disciplined, caring, optimistic, reassuring. All of that times 5 or 6.
Mm.
And so I saw those adjectives again as his first year president. And I said, this is scary. These adjectives were the adjectives we had been asked at Andover, the beginning of our junior year, to describe George W. Bush. If we were as literate as this, we had been as literate as this, these are the same adjectives we
Wow.
would have used to describe him. He was the same way at 15 that he is as the first year of the presidency.
Mm.
So he brought so much to the table, and then being around his dad and so forth, he could see how that gets applied.
My last question for you is, what was he like in moments of crisis? When we're recording this podcast, we're in the middle of, I think all of us would agree, is a crisis, both from a public health standpoint, but equally as much as an economic crisis. And so I'd be curious as to what you observed about him in the moment, of a crisis, when everyone else is kind of in quasi panic mode and not thinking clearly. What did you observe of him in the middle of a crisis that made him stand out as a leader?
He was very calming. He would say when people we had a crisis with the legislature and some big thing was not going to pass or whatever, or we were having trouble getting an answer for this or getting the money for that, or we couldn't come up with an idea for doing this, or he would say, wait a minute. It's supposed to be hard. Have you read the Constitution? Have you read American history? It's designed to be this hard. They did a really good job of designing our government to have lots of checks and balances. So, for instance, one of the things we decided in terms of recommending people to him to appoint to key jobs is, had they ever been in a job where they're told no a lot?
Hmm.
Because the first time you're told no should not be when you're the secretary or the deputy secretary or the assistant secretary for something.
Yeah.
Because it means a lot then, and we don't want you to be shocked to be told no for the first time. And there are people that grow up that, given their whatever, they're never told no, or they just always had their way with things. That's not the case in the federal government. And so, he's always trying to calm you down. It's like, first of all, you want to say you're not allowed to be anxious. You're not allowed to be fearful. No, he never says, I'm not afraid. He never says, I'm not anxious, but it's supposed to be hard. So I know it's supposed to be hard. And so, yeah, I'm going to have to work harder. We're going to be smarter, but we can do this because that's why you all were asked to be here. And that's why he put on his first cabinet Don Rumsfeld and Colin Powell. I mean, so when 9/11 happened, let's see, who do we have as the head of state, head of the DOD? Okay, well, I think we got this one covered. I mean, it's just, he goes after the kind of people that were he knew how difficult it was going to be, and the degree of difficulty and the caliber of people he needed to surround himself with. And so that's why he placed so much attention on what is this person capable of doing if and when they're called upon to do that, because they could very well be called upon to do that.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I really appreciate you joining us. This has been a real treat for me. It's been a long time.
One more comment.
Yeah, please.
Real quick. One thing I haven't talked about in here is one of my favorite stories about Bush is he talks about when he went to his first governor's conference, and I don't know whether it was a Republican governor's conference or a national governor's conference, but he was there and meeting the governors. He was a brand new governor, and some person who had been a governor somewhere for a long time, sounded like the way Bush relayed this. He was probably somebody from the South. He went up and introduced himself, and I'm Governor so and so from wherever. And he said, "Governor, there are two kind of governors in this world, two kind of peoples in this world. Some governors like to be, and some governors like to do. I understand you're a governor that's going to like to do. That's the kind of governor you want to be." And presidents of personnel in the appointments office, we try to figure out what does that mean when we're trying to hire people or recommend people for him. We want people who are going to do. We don't want people who want an appointment, who want to be this position or that position. So one of the things we found out is, and looked at and proved that was a valid way of doing it, is go through a person's resume and yellow highlight the verbs. Invariably, they're all active verbs or passive verbs. You want an active verb person. They were not the assistant secretary of whatever. They accomplished la-da-da-da-da as the assistant secretary. It's what they did, not what the position they had. And so he's a doer. And so, when you're growing up, you will look for jobs to do. Am I going to be able to do? And then you want to do it a resume. You want to talk about it. Bush hadn't thought of it in those terms, so that governor came up to him his first month or so on the job as governor. But it's something we tried to build into everything we advised him to do. It's all about doing it. It's what we tried to build into all the people we recommended he surround himself with, doers. And I think he got them, and he put this capital D, capital O on them, everything that he turned his attention to.
It's really good. Yeah, thanks for all that insight and for sharing. Well, we really appreciate you. Thank you for joining the podcast and for sharing all your wisdom and the stories. I mean, I could keep doing this for a while. So it's been a real pleasure to reconnect with you, and thanks for joining the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kay. Appreciate it.